Franz Liszt by Grant Smith. Liszt's early years were not that of a normal child. Liszt was born in Debrecen, Hungary, to Adam and Anna Liszt in 1811. He began learning to play instruments such as cello, violin, guitar, and piano at only the age of 6. And soon after that, at the age of 8, he began to compose his first music and was considered a prodigy for his age. At 9, he began to perform in concerts and was eventually approached by a group of rich benefactors who offered to pay for his musical education in Vienna. Liszt studied under Karl Czerny and soon began to play in official concerts, which were a huge success. In 1823, Liszt wrote his official first composition. Liszt had a very up and down middle of his life. This was beginning with his father dying in 1827, when Liszt was only just 15 years old. Adam Liszt, his father, was one of the main reasons that Franz got into music because he was his first instructor when he was so young. So this death hit him very hard, to the point where he stopped composing songs completely and started to give piano lessons and began to question his music as a profession. Liszt began to focus on art and religion and began to do a lot of reading. And he fell into depression up until the July Revolution, which oddly was said to snap him out of it. After this depression, he began to take up music again and studying harder than he had ever before, with famous composers such as Frederick Chopin and Hector Berlioz. And Liszt's main focus in life became to perfect the piano and become a virtuoso in the piano. Liszt's adult life was somewhat controversial and scandalous at the beginning. Liszt had a daughter with Countess Marie de Gault in 1835, but because the Countess was already married, they moved to Europe and started to travel there so they could avoid scandal. They also had a second daughter named Cosima in 1839, and shortly after that they had a son named Daniel in the same year. In 1844, Liszt and the Countess began to grow apart and eventually separated. And in the following years, they would said that Liszt had a couple of partners, but none of those relationships lasted long. In 1859, Liszt's son died, and a couple of years later, his first daughter died at the age of 26. Before the end of Liszt's life, he constantly traveled and was eventually named the president of the Hungarian Royal Academy. And Liszt died in 1886 on July 31st. In 1842, Lisztomania began, as women across Europe went crazy over Liszt's presence, even doing things such as ripping his handkerchief apart to keep as a souvenir. And this isn't confirmed to be true, but it said that in concerts, women were said to have started throwing their underwear at him. People went crazy over his looks and his music. And in 1847, his public opinion and public image only went up because most of his earnings were donated to several charities. In the same year, Liszt retired as a virtuoso of the piano and went back to focus on his compositions. So throughout history, it seems that there's only really two opinions that critics have of Liszt, and it's either they love him or they hate him. Because during his time as a composer and virtuoso, he did have his fair share of critics. An example of this, Miles Hoffman, who is a present-day music critic, describes Liszt as not so much a great composer, but was extraordinarily important as a composer. As Hoffman discusses how Liszt did bring a lot of change to the musical world, but the works that he created were not as good as people might have said they were. And I think this is probably because there was a certain mold that composers were supposed to fit in at the time, and Liszt did not fit that mold at all. Many critics argue that the flashiness and complexity of his work render it rather shallow. So Liszt is most known for a couple things, the first being the symphonic poem. These were a form of music that he invented, and the purpose of it is to be more free-flowing, and it does have a lot of similarities with a sonata. Liszt also created a series of 13 orchestral works called the symphonic poems. The first symphonic poem is called Les Coins Éteints sur la Montagne. The purpose of these works is to take poems and legends from the past and turn it to where the orchestras can play them and so that emotions can be captured in the music. The most known probably example of this is Hamlet. It is based off of Shakespeare's play, where the music is able to be captured and fully expressed in the entire plot. The music is also meant to inspire listeners to imagine scenes, images, and different moods throughout. And these symphonic poems are much more flexible than any other works that came before it. So one of probably the most known work that Liszt created was Hungarian Rhapsody. Most people know specifically Hungarian Rhapsody No. 2. That's of 19 works that he created in this entire section. This was written in the late 1840s, and the work is meant to mix virtuosic showmanship and compositional ambition. The work begins slow and dignified, but quickly increases in pressure, speed, and suspense. The first section of this piece follows the form of Lasan, and this section follows the form of Friska. Hungarian Rhapsody was so popular because of how well it is able to express its Hungarian heritage, and this is because Liszt loved his native land of Hungary, so he wanted to push this Hungarian heritage as much as he possibly could during the song. So many of the notes in this work came directly from Hungarian folk dances, and in this work, Liszt uses the piano to imitate the sounds of a gypsy band. Liszt also uses the gypsy scale in all of his rhapsodies. This scale provides a series of notes with exotic Hungarian themes, just because Liszt wanted to make this song as culturally Hungarian as possible to show his love for his native country. Liszt likes the idea of incorporating different strategies to get the most exotic sounds. One of these strategies is called the three-hand illusion, and this is where the player is just playing with two hands, but it sounds like there's three hands playing on the piano at one time. Another one of Liszt's more famous works is La Campanella. La Campanella is a nickname given to Liszt's third of 6 works in the series of Grandes Etudes de Paganini. Etudes are meant to be shorter pieces of music that are more difficult to play and require a lot of experience on the piano. Liszt wrote the song when he was traveling through Italy, so the name of the song is actually Italian for the little bell. And the etude is considered to be one of the most difficult pieces of music to ever be written for the piano. The piece is so difficult because of the large jumps across the piano that both hands have to make during the song. The left hand has to jump an entire octave during it, and the right hand has to jump even more, almost up to 2 octaves. And to be able to play La Campanella, you must have great hand strength and a lot of hand agility as well. And this piece is yet another example of Franz Liszt being willing to push the boundaries of music that people wouldn't be willing to push before. Well, although Liszt wasn't living during the Renaissance, he didn't grow up in the Renaissance, I do see a lot of comparisons between his values and his ideas and Renaissance values that we discussed in class so far this year. His music was different and very unique. No one else had done anything like he's done before. He came up with different music styles, such as the symphonic poems, that were able to be revolutionary at the time and change the way people thought about music. People, even though he was born in Hungary, people refer to him as Hungarian, French, and Italian because his music incorporated all 3 musical values, and his work transcended national categories that other composers refused to pass at the time and before him. Liszt was also able to bridge music genres, bringing the piano away from simply classical themes that it was considered to be before. Before Liszt, art, music, and literature were all kept relatively separate. Liszt was able to merge these 3, with his music being able to evoke more emotion ideas of stories, kind of similar to like modern-day television. He also brought ideas of modern-day romanticism and modernism in music, and without him, they wouldn't be where they are today. Liszt's creativity and willingness to push boundaries made him different than anyone else. And in terms of his concerts, he was one of the first to open up widely to the public, because before him, concerts were more for the more rich and upper class, but he opened them to all of society and all the public. And because of this, his concerts were more enjoyable and accessible to the public than they ever had been before. Liszt was able to recognize the public's interest, including politics, art, history, and religion. Liszt commonly broke the rules and created new paths for musicians and composers that hadn't been